Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Sky and this is Historical Vtuber Talks. Before beginning with the video, I'm just gonna briefly address the fact that yes, I do know I haven't uploaded for a long ass time. I'm not very good with consistent uploads and the last upload was several months ago. I believe it's been a year. I'm gonna try to upload a little bit more regularly from this point on, but we'll see how it goes, considering that even by the time of recording this, my primary monitor seems intent on dying on me. So, I promise nothing. But with that out of the way, let us actually begin. So, the topic of this video will be the ever so popular Chinese mountain pattern armor. Before we begin to explain what we know about this armor historically, first I'm going to give you an overview of what the popular conception of what mountain pattern armor is, which I will be, thoroughly debunking in this video. The idea is that the mountain pattern armor is a unique type of Chinese scale-ish armor, named so because the scales themselves vaguely resemble the Chinese character for mountain, and this armor was supposedly very resistant against arrows and stuff, and also very flexible, and it's a uniquely Chinese thing, and Chinese nationalists love to fucking flock around it and stuff like that. Now that we've got that out of the way, I guarantee that anybody who's ever been interested in historical Chinese armor has come across this type of armor before. Let's talk about what it actually is. What do we know about it, and what more specifically do we not know about it? Let us begin with the terminology mountain pattern armor. Where does this show up? Well, primarily the source that is usually cited for the term mountain pattern armor, or in Chinese, Shanwenjia, is the Tang Liudan, written in the Tang dynasty, which mentions several forms of armor, among them including mountain pattern armor, or as mentioned, Shanwenjia. In the Tang Liudan, it's mentioned that the mountain pattern armor was pretty protective and also very flexible in comparison to some other armors. Now, let's talk about this pattern style of armor. What do we know about this? Well, this pattern starts popping up in armor during the Tang dynasty and shows up pretty consistently throughout the Chinese dynasties from that point onwards into the Qing dynasty. However, and this is where we get to the crux of the matter, is that in no source where this pattern is accompanied by text, and there is a few of those, it is not called mountain pattern. Let us look at two primary examples where we can clearly see that this is not the case. The first example is in the Ming Dynasty treatise, the Wu Beiji. The Wu Beiji is a treatise talking about various forms of armor and weaponry. In this, in one of the armor pieces, we do see this quote-unquote mountain pattern, or the so-called mountain pattern, except that it's not called that. This is referred to with the same term as lamella armor. Nowhere in the Wu Beiji do we ever see the term Shanwenjia. It's not present. Let us talk about the other place in which this shows up. This is the Jingxiao Faji, which is a Song Dynasty architectural treatise written around the 11th or possibly very early 12th century. In the Jingxiao Faji, we get to specifically see a pattern, which would be this so-called mountain pattern, except it's not called Shanwen. This is called Shoji. Shoji translates roughly to interlocking, because this pattern interlocks with itself. To make things matters slightly more complicated, and we will discuss more about this in a few moments, is that the term shoji is used for armor. It is in fact the term used for maille, because maille is armor made out of interlocking rings. Maille armor is usually referred to as shojija, which has taken to claims that this so-called mountain pattern, which is not mountain pattern, is in fact a type of maille armor. And there are some arguments for and some arguments against this, which we will discuss in just a moment. Before we do that though, it is important to point out that there's also not just a single type of this pattern seen on armored statues and depictions. There is in fact several. In the Wu Beiji, which I showed earlier, we can see two different patterns, and in various Ming Dynasty statues, We can also see a few different patterns, some which look surprisingly a lot like maille, others which look quite different. And this makes it significantly more complicated to try to get a hold of an understanding for what we're actually seeing. But that is what I'm going to attempt to present to you today. I will, however, point out that everything that's going to be in this video from this point forward is mostly going to be conjecture and interpretations. And I'm going to be very clear about when that's the case, because there's simply no clear-cut answers about what we're looking at here. That being said, let's just discuss the theory that this style of armor is actually maille. So, the primary argument for interpreting this as maille is due to its mention in the Jing Chao Faji as shuoji. And because shuojijo is usually used as a term for maille armor, this then has given rise to the argument that this is probably maille armor. And the counter-argument to this is usually, but in some statues we see maille armor depicted, and we also see this pattern depicted, so clearly it cannot be maille armor if this pattern is also depicted on the statue. I do not believe that this counter-argument holds for two reasons. Reason number one. Usually the interpretation that this style of armor is maille comes with the assumption that it is a more unique weave of maille, something along these lines. And if that's the case, then it makes perfect sense for why we would see regular 4-in-1 maille depicted alongside this specific style of maille, both on the same statue, because they do not look the same. Second argument is that even if we assume its origins might have been maille, this pattern has long since lost that connotation in artworks and has developed into its own artistic thing, which we clearly can see due to its use in architecture, as something separate from what its origin might have originally been. The argument that says that this is maille armor simply says that the pattern might have originated in a specific weave of maille, but clearly by these latest Ming Dynasty statues, it has long since lost that connotation, because in the Qing Dynasty, we actually see this pattern put on textile on brigandines. I do not think that the counter-argument, well, you see normal maille depicted on statues too, so this cannot be maille, holds up. And there's also one more interesting thing here. If we look at Japanese maille of the sort of Sengoku era, we can actually see some unique sort of Japanese ways of making maille that look a little bit like this other pattern in the Wu Beiji. There is superficial resemblance between these two, and Wu Beiji was after the Imjin War had happened. So the Chinese, the Ming Dynasty Chinese, would at this point have been familiar with this style of Japanese maille making. And so these two patterns is not completely impossible or related. However, I do not think that what we're seeing are maille patterns either, personally. Even though the argument that they might be maille patterns is relatively convincing, the reason I do not believe this to be the case is because in these, especially in the Ming and Qing dynasty depictions definitively at that point, it has long since not had a connotation with being a form of armor, but instead tends to be found on textile patterns on top of armor. And that is most likely what we're seeing here in the Wu Beiji, is a textile covering for lamella armor. And in the aforementioned Qing dynasty brigandines, we're also seeing this as a textile pattern put on top of, the armored plates. Moreover, we see these patterns in other Chinese Buddhist-influenced regions. We see it in Tibet. We see Tibetan shamans wearing a similar pattern to this. And this pattern is often in Chinese artwork also associated quite a lot with Buddhist figures or legendary hero-style, mythic-style figures. And more rarely do we see this associated with earthly figures. In fact, I would propose the interpretation that this specific Shuoji pattern is a pattern that has some unknown symbolic influence and symbolic meaning within Chinese and Chinese-influenced Buddhism that we simply don't know what it is. And I personally propose that this has been a thing from the very get-go. We see a lot of Buddhist themes in Tang artwork, and this is likely why this pattern becomes prevalent in the Tang dynasty and spreads via Tang dynasty influence and then remains an artistic staple in Chinese dynasties up to the Qing dynasty. Except that it's difficult to say what sort of significance this pattern might have held. Regardless, it is my theory that that is sort of the case. It has some sort of religious, heavenly connotations. And so then the attempt to put this on armor does not involve making it out of actual metal, but instead simply representing it in a suitable medium, which is usually textile, put on top of the armor. And I believe that this is what we have been seeing all the way from the beginning of the Tang dynasty, all the way into the Qing dynasty. However, I cannot say this for certain, and it is possible that the argument that it was in fact a unique style of maille is also a possibility. Regardless of what it is, what we can say for certain is that this pattern is not called mountain pattern, and what we can say for almost absolute certain is that it was not a unique style of scale armor that the Chinese had made out of metal. We are seeing an artistic thing, a sort of Buddhist associated thing, which perhaps had its origin in specific styles of maille, but maybe did not. We cannot tell. But that leaves one elephant in the room. This is not mountain pattern armor. Then what is? What is the Shanwenja that is mentioned in the Tang Ludian? And here we have two possible options, which seem to be the likeliest interpretations. One, it is maille armor. Even though there's already a term for maille armor, that being shuozhijia, in the Tang dynasty specifically, is when maille armor gets more prevalent in Chinese sources, particularly by its association to Tibet and Tibetan cavalry. Due to this, it would be prudent to assume that the term Shanwenja, as in mountain pattern armor, might refer to literally the mountainous regions of Tibet in which this armor was widespread, according to contemporary Chinese sources. And this would have been an alternate name that it would have had instead of Shuozhijia, and both terms would have probably been used in reference to it. This fits because maille armor is very flexible, and so it fits the description in the Tang Ludian about the protective and flexible capabilities of Shanwenja. The second interpretation is that it is the style of lamellar. There have been some lamellae found which have this sort of mountain character pattern on them, and maybe Shanwenja is specifically referring to lamellar made up of small lanes such as this one. Lamellar armor is still relatively flexible, however it would not be quite as flexible as maille, so perhaps thinking of it as maille is more prudent because it would better fit the description of being notably flexible. Regardless, either this form of lamellar or simply maille is the likeliest explanation to what Shanwenja is, and this should be completely divorced from the phenomenon of this pattern, as I've explained previously, which is something else entirely and should be thought of as something else entirely. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any thoughts, corrections, leave them down in the comments below and I will try to address them as I can. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all some other time.